In the autumn of 1880, when the first heavy shipping crates from Connecticut were pried open in British high street jewelers, the traditional clockmakers of Clerkenwell did not immediately realize their centuries-old monopoly was over. Inside were the latest products of the Waterbury Clock Company. They had not just exported a timepiece across the Atlantic, they had exported a price tag that made British domestic workshop craft instantly obsolete. At the time, a reliable English fusee wall clock, driven by a coiled mainspring and regulated by hand-cut brass wheels, cost several pounds, representing weeks of wages for a skilled laborer. But the stamped brass Waterbury shelf clocks arrived on British shores retailing for mere shillings. By the thousands, these cheap, mass-produced mechanisms flooded into provincial jewelers' windows, mail-order catalogs, and working-class sitting rooms, aggressively rewriting the economics of the entire market. The consequence for the domestic trade was sudden and devastating. British casemakers found themselves severely outpriced. Independent repairmen who relied on assembling hand-finished brass plates and steel pivots discovered a chilling mathematical reality. They could not even buy the raw materials for their craft for the retail price of a finished Waterbury clock. Meanwhile, ordinary British families who had previously relied on the public church tower or the local railway station clock for their daily rhythm could suddenly afford to place a ticking dial on their own mantelpiece. The paradox is that Waterbury did not conquer the British market by offering a superior clock. They conquered it by offering a timepiece that was simply good enough. But the real story of the Waterbury Clock Company in Britain is not merely about cheap American imports undercutting local workshops. It is the story of how a factory in Connecticut taught the British public that time could be bought, used, and eventually thrown away. Every week, we document the timepieces, factories, and high street jewelers that once taught Britain how to live with time, and explore what happened when those markets disappeared. Subscribe if this horological history matters to you. The story of this disposable revolution begins not in a London workshop, but inside a loud, brass stamping factory in Connecticut in 1854. In the middle of the 19th century, the vast majority of the British working class did not own domestic time. For a textile worker in Manchester, a coal miner in Yorkshire, or a railway porter in London, the rhythm of the day was dictated entirely by external forces. It was the factory whistle, the church turret clock, or the local knocker-up, a person paid to tap on bedroom windows with a long pole that woke the terraced streets. The concept of owning a personal, reliable clock was a luxury reserved for those who could afford the painstaking, highly specialized labor of the traditional British horological trade. At this time, the domestic clock market was proudly dominated by traditional manufacturing hubs like Clerkenwell in London and Prescott in Lancashire. A standard English wall clock or bracket clock relied on a fusee, a cone-shaped pulley and chain system that evens out the force of a mainspring as it unwinds, which meant a spring-driven clock could keep exceedingly steady time in a British office or hallway. But this mechanical precision was phenomenally expensive. The movement, the internal mechanism that makes a clock or watch run, was built from thick, heavy cast brass plates. The gear wheels were individually cut by hand. The steel pivots were hardened, tempered, and polished by highly trained specialists. Because of this intense, compartmentalized manual labor, a basic English timepiece cost several pounds. It was an heirloom, designed to be serviced, repaired, and passed down through generations. A traditional English long case clock, a tall floor-standing clock with a pendulum and weights inside a wooden case, was the ultimate symbol of household permanence, often taking months to complete. The British trade assumed this model was impenetrable. They firmly believed that timekeeping required craft, and that true craft required time. But 3,000 miles away, in the Naugatuck River Valley of Connecticut, a radically different industrial philosophy was emerging. In 1854, the Waterbury Clock Company was formally incorporated. Crucially, its parent company, Benedict and Burnham, was not a horological dynasty. They were a brass manufacturing firm. They made buttons, pins, and industrial metal strips. They did not view a clock as a delicate scientific instrument or a work of art. They viewed it as an assembly of brass parts that could be stamped out of sheet metal by heavy machinery. The terrifying reality was that a button-making factory was about to disrupt centuries of British clockmaking by treating timepieces as mere industrial hardware. Waterbury applied the brute force of the American Industrial Revolution to the delicate art of timekeeping. Instead of casting and hand-cutting thick brass plates, they stamped thin plates out of rolled brass in massive presses. Instead of carefully finishing an escapement, the mechanism that releases power one beat at a time and creates the tick, they engineered mechanisms with wide tolerances that could be assembled rapidly by unskilled machine operators. The resulting movement was unrefined, noisy, and practically impossible to repair in the traditional sense, but it worked. More importantly, it cost mere pennies to produce. By the 1870s, these American clocks began arriving at British ports in massive numbers, heavily targeting the docks of Liverpool before spreading rapidly across the railway network to provincial towns. The most common early export was the OG clock, a rectangular shelf clock with an S-curve wood molding, which was incredibly cheap to build and easy to ship flat in wooden crates. The case, the wooden or metal body that protects the movement and gives the timepiece its physical presence, was usually veneered in cheap mahogany over basic pine. The strike, the sound made when a clock counts the hour on a bell, gong, or coil, was often produced by a simple wire gong, sounding entirely different from the rich resonance of a thick English cast bell. When these Waterbury clocks first appeared in British high street jewelers and mail-order catalogs, the domestic clockmakers scoffed at the crude engineering. A Clerkenwell craftsman, inspecting the stamped wheels and thin plates, would have dismissed it as a disposable toy. The metal was too thin for a traditional bushing, a small repair insert used to tighten worn pivot holes in a clock plate. If a Waterbury clock stopped running after a few years of accumulating dust, a British repair bench could do very little with it. The plates were often riveted together or held by cheap pins, rather than being secured by carefully turned steel pillars and screws. It was the exact moment a British repairer realized the clock could not be serviced. But the customer did not care, because buying a brand new American clock was actually cheaper than paying for a British repair. The British horological establishment had completely misjudged the realities of the consumer market. A working-class family in a Victorian terraced house did not care that a Waterbury OG clock lacked a finely cut fusee or polished pinions. They cared that it cost a fraction of a British clock. For the very first time in history, a railway laborer could walk into a local shop or browse a catalog and buy a ticking clock for his mantelpiece for less than a week's wages. Waterbury democratized time in Britain by aggressively lowering the baseline of quality to a level that was simply good enough. This sudden influx of cheap Connecticut timepieces triggered the first major systemic crisis in the British domestic clock trade. The local casemakers, who crafted the wooden housings for traditional bracket clocks and long case clocks, suddenly found their order books shrinking. The independent watch and clock repairers, the men who sat at dusty benches in provincial towns cutting new teeth into broken wheels, were forced to watch as potential customers walked out of high street jewelers carrying disposable American boxes. The British market had always valued longevity, permanence, terms, and repairability. Waterbury aggressively taught them to value immediacy and price. The Connecticut factory had mastered the machine. It mastered benters, successfully placing a ticking dial on thousands of British mantelpieces. But to truly dominate the empire of time, they now had to prove they could shrink that same disposable philosophy into the pocket of a British worker. The OG shelf clock had successfully breached the British domestic hallway, but a clock on a mantelpiece still belonged to the house. To truly dominate the British measurement of time, the Waterbury Clock Company and its newly formed sister enterprise, the Waterbury Watch Company, had to put a ticking dial directly into the pockets of the British working class. In the early 1880s, owning a pocket watch in Britain was still a definitive sign of established middle class or professional status. A traditional English pocket watch, a portable timepiece designed to be carried in a waistcoat, was a serious, carefully considered investment. It was typically built in the specialized workshops of Coventry or Prescott, featuring a heavy silver case, a delicate enamel dial, and a miniaturized fusee movement. This movement, the internal mechanism that makes a clock or watch run, required highly skilled finishers to adjust the balance wheel and hairspring by hand. Because of this compartmentalized, highly trained labor, a basic English pocket watch cost several pounds. It was a rite of passage, a valuable object to be meticulously serviced by local craftsmen and eventually handed down to the next generation. Waterbury shattered this generational model by introducing a watch that was engineered entirely like a piece of industrial hardware. In 1880, they launched their first mass-produced pocket watch, which became famously known as the Long Wind. The design was mechanically bizarre but economically brilliant. Instead of the delicate hand-polished pinions of an English watch, the entire movement rotated inside the case every hour. It was powered by an enormous mainspring, a coiled strip of metal that stores energy when wound with a crown, which was an astonishing 9 feet long. It took an agonizing number of turns to fully wind the watch, earning it the immediate mockery of the traditional British trade. But the British horological establishment completely missed the threat. The Long Wind was not designed for mechanical elegance. It was designed for the stamping press. The brass plates were punched out by the thousands. The escapement, the mechanism that releases power one beat at a time and creates the tick, was stripped of expensive jewels and built with wide tolerances that required absolutely no hand fitting. The result was a loud, heavy, unrefined watch that retailed in Britain for roughly half a sovereign, a mere fraction of the cost of the cheapest Coventry-made alternative. The true breakthrough, however, was not just how the watch was manufactured, but how it was forced into the British retail ecosystem. When the first large shipments of Waterbury watches arrived, traditional high street jewelers, the established retail shops that sold and serviced fine goods, flatly refused to stock them. To a trained British watchmaker, these stamped brass devices were unrepairable insults to their profession. They offered no margin for future servicing, and servicing was the lifeblood of a local jeweler's business model. Faced with a closed high street network, Waterbury simply bypassed the horological establishment entirely. They distributed their cheap watches through mail-order catalogs, hardware merchants, bootmakers, and drapers. A textile worker in Lancashire or a coal miner in Yorkshire no longer had to cross the threshold of an intimidating, hushed jeweler's shop to purchase time. They could buy a Waterbury watch alongside their work boots, winter coats, or haberdashery. This distribution shift moved the pocket watch from the realm of the specialist into the realm of the generalist, turning it into a fast-moving consumer good. The consequence for the British timekeeping landscape was profound. For the first time in the nation's history, ordinary manual laborers carried their own personal time. A railway porter on the Great Western Railway no longer had to rely solely on the grand station clock to know the exact minute. He had a Waterbury ticking loudly in his pocket. A factory worker no longer had to blindly trust the overseer's whistle. He could verify the end of his shift himself. Personal time ownership was aggressively democratized, but it came at the direct expense of the domestic manufacturing base. The workshops of Prescott, which supplied the rough movements for the English trade, began to see their orders collapse. They simply could not compete with the brutal efficiency of American metal presses. This influx created a new, deeply uncomfortable reality at the British watch repair bench, the workspace where craftsmen traditionally cleaned, oiled, and adjusted movements. When a Waterbury watch eventually stopped, usually because dust had bypassed the cheap case and mixed with the oil to create an abrasive paste, the owner would naturally take it to a local repairer. The craftsman would look at the riveted brass plates, the lack of traditional screws, and the unpolished steel pivots, and realize that dismantling the watch would take hours of frustrating, unprofitable labor. The repair estimate would frequently equal or even exceed the original purchase price of the watch. It was a pivotal psychological shift for the British consumer. When the repair cost more than the object itself, the logical economic choice was to throw the watch away and buy a new one. The Waterbury watch taught the British public that time was disposable. By the end of the 1880s, the sheer volume of consumer demand broke the resistance of the high street jewelers. Realizing they were rapidly losing footfall to hardware stores and mail-order catalogs, the traditional clock and watch shops reluctantly cleared their window space for the American imports. Waterbury had successfully breached the walls of British horology, proving that sheer volume and low prices could overcome centuries of entrenched craft. But the American factory's ultimate conquest of the British pocket was yet to come, requiring a partnership that would turn a cheap import into an inescapable household empire. By the final decade of the 19th century, the Waterbury Clock Company was no longer merely a foreign disruptor. It was an industrial titan that had fundamentally rewritten the landscape of British domestic time. The massive wooden crates arriving at the Liverpool docks were no longer viewed as a passing American novelty. They were the logistical lifeblood of a new era. Waterbury had transitioned from a bold experiment in stamped metal into a household empire, reaching a scale of production that completely paralyzed the traditional British horological establishment. Their absolute dominance of the British pocket watch market was cemented by a legendary commercial partnership. While Waterbury possessed the heavy stamping presses and the vast factory capacity, it was the marketing genius of Robert H. Ingersoll and Brothers that turned a cheap Connecticut mechanism into an inescapable British commodity. Ingersoll contracted the Waterbury factory to manufacture millions of cheap, reliable pocket watches. When these timepieces, famously marketed as the Crown watch in Britain, flooded across the Atlantic, they completely bypassed the restrictive networks of elite watchmaking. The engineering behind this scale was aggressively pragmatic. Waterbury perfected the pin pallet escapement for these mass-market watches. A pin pallet escapement, a cheap, robust mechanism where the delicate, hand-polished jeweled pallets of a traditional watch are replaced by simple steel pins, meant the watch could be assembled with loose tolerances by unskilled labor on a moving production line. It ticked loudly, it was relatively heavy, and it lacked any horological refinement, but it kept time well enough to organize a working day. The distribution network was equally ruthless. Gamages of Holborn, the sprawling London department store famous for its comprehensive mail-order catalogs, dedicated entire pages to these Waterbury-made Ingersoll watches. A customer no longer needed to live near a specialist clockmaker in Clerkenwell to acquire a reliable timepiece. Through the Gamages catalog, a farm laborer in Somerset or a shipyard worker in Glasgow could simply post a postal order and receive a ticking watch in a cardboard box a few days later. This retail revolution forced a painful surrender from the British High Street. Expanding commercial jewelers, such as the rapidly growing H. Samuel chain, recognized that the working-class appetite for cheap time could not be suppressed by horological snobbery. To survive, these jewelers had to place Waterbury shelf clocks and Ingersoll pocket watches directly in their display windows, sitting uncomfortably alongside traditional English, silver, and gold stock. The sheer volume of footfall generated by these cheap American imports was simply too lucrative to refuse. The cultural shift was unprecedented. For the very first time, time ownership was truly universal. A young boy going to work in a Yorkshire coal mine could carry the exact same timekeeping technology as a clerk in a London banking office. In a Lancashire textile mill, the workers no longer relied entirely on the imposing factory clock, a large, clear wall dial designed to dictate the shift patterns of the workforce, because they now had their own personal reference ticking in their waistcoat pockets. The scale of this operation created a terrifying mathematical reality for the British trade. A highly skilled watchmaker in Coventry, the historic heart of British watch manufacturing, could carefully finish and regulate perhaps one high-grade silver pocket watch in a week. In that exact same week, a single Waterbury stamping press in Connecticut could punch out the brass plates for tens of thousands of movements. The British workshop model was built on the premise that accuracy required immense time and generational skill. Waterbury proved that accuracy only required heavy machinery and volume. The American factory had successfully placed a dial in the British pocket, on the British high street counter, and in the British mail order catalog. But their ultimate triumph was not just selling a cheap object. It was fundamentally changing how the British household interacted with the concept of the clock itself. By the dawn of the Edwardian era, the Waterbury footprint in Britain was no longer confined to the waistcoat pocket. It had aggressively absorbed the domestic interior. The Connecticut factory recognized that if they could mass-produce a pocket watch movement, they could apply the exact same industrial logic to a bedside alarm clock. The arrival of the cheap, nickel-plated drum clock, a small, cylindrical, spring-driven timepiece housed in a basic metal shell, designed specifically to wake a sleeping worker, fundamentally altered the morning ritual of the British labor force. In a working-class British sitting room, where the mantel clock had traditionally stood as a heavy, expensive anchor of family memory, the ticking Waterbury dial did not merely mark the hour. It proved that time had become a disposable commodity. Before Waterbury's massive export push, the concept of a dedicated bedroom clock was an extravagant luxury reserved for the wealthy. The working classes relied on public bells or the local knocker-up. But suddenly, a tin-cased alarm clock cost so little that it became a standard, unglamorous household appliance. The sound that woke the Lancashire mill worker, the Clydebank shipbuilder, or the London tram driver was no longer the footsteps of a man with a long pole tapping on the window pane. It was the frantic, metallic ringing of a cheap American mainspring, a coiled strip of metal that stores energy, releasing its tension against a stamped brass bell. This total market saturation created a bitter economic paradox. Within the traditional British horological trade, the independent clockmakers and watchmakers of Clerkenwell and Coventry, the men who had spent years apprenticing to hand-cut brass wheels and polished steel pivots, were rapidly forced to abandon manufacturing entirely. The domestic workshops simply could not survive on repair work alone, nor could they compete with American prices. To keep their shops open, these proud craftsmen had to become mere retailers of foreign metal. Their high street windows, which had once proudly displayed domestic craft, were now crowded with rows of identical Waterbury shelf clocks, OG clocks, and Ingersoll pocket watches. The local jeweler was no longer selling a lifelong investment. He was managing high-volume inventory. At the absolute peak of this transatlantic trade in the early 1900s, millions of these stamped timepieces were actively ticking across the British Isles. The volume was so overwhelming that the British watchmaking capital, Coventry, effectively collapsed under the pressure. While a few Coventry firms desperately tried to adopt factory methods, they were decades too late and lacked the vast capital of the American giants. Waterbury had successfully hollowed out the middle and lower tiers of the British market, leaving only the very high-end marine chronometers, highly accurate shipboard timekeepers used to help calculate longitude at sea, and luxury carriage clocks to the domestic makers. This scale also dictated a harsh new reality at the British repair bench, when a traditional English bracket clock, a spring-driven clock designed for a table or shelf, built with thick plates and screwed pillars, stopped working, the owner immediately sought a repairer. It was a valuable asset worth maintaining. But when a Waterbury bedside clock accumulated dust in its unpolished pivot holes and ground to a halt, the owner faced a drastically different calculation. The local watchmaker, despising the riveted plates and crude, inaccessible construction of the American movement, would often quote a repair fee that matched or exceeded the cost of simply buying a brand new clock from the Gamage's catalog. The economic incentive to repair vanished. The clock was simply thrown into the household rubbish bin, stripped for scrap brass, or handed to a child as a toy. This was Waterbury's ultimate, devastating victory in Britain. They had not merely defeated the local clockmakers on price, they had successfully reprogrammed the British consumer. They normalized the concept of replacement. The longevity of a timepiece, once the highest virtue of British horology, was no longer valued by the mass market. Immediate accessibility and upfront cost were all that mattered. The name Waterbury, heavily intertwined with Ingersoll, had become the absolute, inescapable baseline of British time. The Connecticut factory had conquered the British hallway, the sitting room, and the pocket by proving that mechanical time could be manufactured cheaply and discarded easily. But an empire built entirely on the promise of the lowest possible price had unknowingly set a trap for itself. The empire of cheap, stamped brass time had effectively hollowed out the British domestic manufacturing base, but by the mid-1920s, the Waterbury Clock Company began to experience the very instability it had helped create. The factory's reliance on extremely low price points meant that any disruption in global supply chains or a downturn in the British working-class economy would immediately threaten its precarious business model. The first small crack in the Waterbury facade did not appear in the factory floor's machinery, but at the repair bench of the local high street jeweler. For decades, the British repairer had been the reluctant gatekeeper of the Waterbury brand. They were the ones who had to break the news to a customer that a favorite mantel clock, its movement stamped from thin, unrefined brass plates, was no longer worth servicing. As the quality of mass-market materials continued to drop in favor of even thinner metal and cheaper alloys, the repairer's refusal rate began to climb. By the late 1920s, a subtle but decisive shift occurred in the catalogs of major British retailers like Gamage's. The front pages, which had once been dedicated to the reliable, if unrefined, Waterbury shelf clocks, began to feature more compact, modern-looking timepieces sourced from emerging German factories and even lower-cost domestic lines. The Waterbury name, once a synonym for affordable time, began to feel dated. The long-wind pocket watch, while still functional, looked heavy and archaic compared to the slimmer, more fashionable designs coming from Swiss factories that were rapidly mastering mass production. This was the first significant signal of the British market's changing loyalty. The British consumer had been taught that time was cheap, but they had also been taught to equate newness with value. When the Waterbury models stayed visually the same year after year, they stopped feeling like a modern upgrade and started feeling like leftover stock. The jeweler's repair bench, once the site of a relationship between the family and the clockmaker, was becoming a site of transactional frustration. When a customer brought in a stalled Waterbury, the jeweler would no longer quote a repair fee. They would simply point to a new, cheaper clock on the shelf. The service relationship, the foundational ritual of British horology, was being replaced by a transaction of simple replacement. This was not a sudden collapse, but a quiet erosion of the brand's authority. The factory in Connecticut was still running, but it was losing its grip on the British sitting room. The Great Depression of the early 1930s accelerated this decline with brutal efficiency. As household incomes across Britain tightened, the discretionary spend on even a cheap alarm clock plummeted. Retailers slashed their orders. The mass production model, which required massive volume to remain profitable, began to stumble. The Waterbury Clock Company, once a titan of democratized time, found itself saddled with overhead costs and a product range that the British public no longer prioritized. In 1932, the company was forced into a severe financial restructuring. This was the moment the original American factory, which had once seemed invincible, began to fracture. The management could no longer justify maintaining the massive, sprawling production facilities that had once churned out millions of parts for the British market. The brand was effectively broken. The name Waterbury, which had been stamped into millions of brass plates and sat on countless British mantelpieces, was about to be subsumed into a new corporate identity, signaling the end of its independent reign as the king of British cheap time. The absorption of the Waterbury Clock Company into the United States Time Corporation in 1944 was not merely a corporate reshuffle, it was the final, formal admission that the factory-stamped clock as an independent, standalone enterprise could no longer justify its own existence. For the British market, this change was initially invisible. The name Waterbury, which had for 60 years been stamped onto brass plates and sat on countless British mantelpieces, was quietly phased out. In its place, the new corporate entity pushed a different vision of timekeeping, the Timex watch. The transition from Waterbury to Timex represented a total shift in the consumer philosophy of British time. The Waterbury watch had been marketed as a piece of good-enough industrial hardware, a rugged, reliable, and unrefined object that you bought because it was cheap. The Timex watch, however, was marketed on a new, modern premise, durability through simplicity, famously demonstrated in the 1950s by television advertisements showing the watches surviving intense, violent torture tests. This rebranding fundamentally undermined the repair culture that had been the backbone of the British horological trade for centuries. The Timex movement was even more aggressively designed for the trash heap than its Waterbury predecessor. It was a masterpiece of assembly line engineering. Fewer parts, more stamped metal, and almost zero adjustability. It was not intended to be cleaned, oiled, or regulated by a skilled craftsman at a mahogany-topped repair bench in Clerkenwell. It was intended to be worn, used, and, when it inevitably stopped ticking, discarded. The high street jeweler in a British provincial town was caught in a terminal squeeze. For generations, their reputation had been built on the promise that they could maintain a timepiece for a lifetime. But their customers were now bringing in plastic-cased Timex watches that were chemically and mechanically impossible to service. A jeweler who insisted on charging a reasonable fee for the hours of work required to open, clean, and rebalance such a movement would be laughed out of their own shop. The repair bench, once the heart of the British horological community, became a place of obsolescence. The older generation of clockmakers and watchmakers, who still held the skills to hand-cut a wheel or bush a worn hole, found themselves reduced to changing cheap batteries in quartz clocks or merely acting as a storefront for new, disposable stock. The traditional apprenticeship system in British horology, the formal, multi-year training that passed down the nuances of fusee maintenance and balance wheel regulation, withered. There was no economic reason for a young person to spend 7 years learning a trade that was being replaced by a 6-minute assembly process in a foreign factory. By the late 1960s, the decline was systemic and visible on every British high street. The traditional jeweler, unable to survive on the shrinking margins of mechanical sales and the near-total loss of repair income, began to diversify. They stopped being watchmakers and started being retailers of plated jewelry, silverware, and giftware. The ticking clock, which had once been the reason for their existence, was relegated to the back corner of the store, replaced by digital displays, electric clocks, and eventually the mass-market quartz movement. The quartz revolution, the introduction of battery-powered movements regulated by a vibrating crystal, finally completed what Waterbury had begun in the 1880s. The mechanical clock, the fusee wall clock, the bracket clock, and the long case clock were no longer functional necessities for an organization or a household. They were decorative relics. The factory clock on the wall, the master clock in the railway station, and the mantel clock in the sitting room were all unplugged, silenced, or removed entirely in favor of synchronized electronic displays that required no winding, no oil, and no craftsman's hand. The Waterbury name, once the most powerful brand in the democratization of British time, became an auction room label. It was no longer a synonym for trust. It was an identifier for a specific type of mass-produced, late Victorian industrial object. The sprawling, humming production lines in Connecticut, which had once seemed the inevitable future of all British horology, were long gone, replaced by the global outsourcing of components that had nothing to do with craft and everything to do with cost. The system did not fall because of a single decision. It fell because it had spent decades teaching the British public that time, like the plastic cases of the watches that replaced the brass, was meant to be used up. The ticking had not stopped. The world was louder than ever with the precise, synchronized pulse of quartz and digital signals, but the mechanical heart of British time had effectively stopped beating. The story of the Waterbury Clock Company in Britain is not merely a chronicle of a factory closure or a brand sale. It is a defining chapter in the history of British timekeeping. A story of how the very promise of affordable, accessible time became the architect of its own obsolescence. The factory in Connecticut did not just conquer the British mantelpiece. It fundamentally altered the British relationship with the mechanical object, transforming time from a permanent household anchor into a disposable commodity. Today, the Waterbury name survives largely in the quiet corners of the horological world. You will not find Waterbury clocks ticking in the halls of modern British railway stations, nor will you see their name on the window of a contemporary high street jeweler. Instead, their legacy is preserved in the cluttered cabinets of antique shops in provincial towns, on the chaotic listings of eBay, and in the hands of dedicated collectors who understand that these stamped brass movements were once a revolution. These surviving clocks are not just historical curiosities. They are physical evidence of a moment when Britain had to choose between the permanence of the traditional workshop and the immediacy of the industrial press. While most Waterbury clocks have long been scrapped, discarded, or lost to time, those that remain serve as a stark reminder of what was sacrificed. They prove that when a country moves from a culture of repair to a culture of replacement, it does not just lose its clocks. It loses the specialized skills of the thousands of men and women who once sat at repair benches across the British Isles, ensuring that time could be measured, maintained, and valued for generations. The true legacy of Waterbury is visible in the silence of those thousands of repair benches that once defined the rhythm of British high streets. It is found in the fact that the clockmaking districts of Clerkenwell and Coventry, once vibrant ecosystems of craft, have been completely reshaped, their workshop floors long converted into housing, offices, or retail space. Somewhere in a quiet British hallway, an old, veneered OG clock still sits against a painted wall. Its stamped brass wheels are worn, its gong is dull, and it hasn't been wound for decades, yet its presence remains. The key that once gave it life lies in a nearby kitchen drawer, forgotten and useless. The clock does not show the time, yet it stands as a testament to an era when the ticking of a dial was the most reliable authority in the house. It is a frozen piece of history, waiting for one more careful hand to wind it, just to hear the sound of an empire that once believed it could manufacture time itself. See you in the next video.